Buenos días, muchas gracias a todos por su presencia en esta sesión del seminario del Departamento de Estudios Sociales del COLEF. Es un verdadero gusto tener hoy con nosotros como invitado, conferencista, al profesor Martin Kenny, que es profesor e investigador en el Department of Human and Community Development de la Universidad de California en Davis. Es un autor muy prolífico y muy influyente, que además durante años ha sido un profesor, un colega muy cercano aquí al COLEF, al grupo del Departamento de Estudios Sociales en particular, y que tiene una vastísima obra en la que pues, son varios cientos de trabajos publicados, algunos de ellos muy influyentes. Por ejemplo, su libro Biotechnology, The University Industrial Complex, que tiene más de 800 citas en la literatura especializada. Otro de sus libros, Understanding Silicon Valley, Anatomy of an Entrepreneurial Region, con varios cientos de citas, o su artículo Transplanted Organizations, The Transfer of Japanese Industrial Organization to the U.S., del American Sociological Review. Todos estos trabajos con una gran cantidad, centenares de citas en la literatura especializada, un autor muy prolífico, muy influyente y afortunadamente muy cercano al grupo de trabajo de sistemas productivos del COLEF. Por lo cual realmente es un honor tenerlo como conferencista. Su presentación de hoy se llama Identity Creation and Cluster Construction, The Case of the Paso Robles Wine Region. The conference will be in English with comments by Sara Martinez in Spanish, but you can make the comments or questions either in English or Spanish, or German or Japanese. Professor Kenny is fluent in, I guess, 47 languages, so very welcome. So Martin, thank you again for joining us today and for sharing your work with us.
Well, thank you, Oscar, Jorge, Alfredo, Alara. I know many of the COLEF faculty for 20 years. A great pleasure to be invited back to speak, and I thank all of you for coming to listen to me. I was just at a conference, and this thing didn't work, and so everyone said, speak in your professor's voice, and then there's no problem, you don't need this. But okay, I will speak not in my professor's voice unless it's necessary for the people in back. But let me just start here. So let me introduce you to why I got interested in this. I've been working in Silicon Valley, high-tech, university-industry relations for a very long time. Oscar and I did some, I think, pretty good work on the maquilas, particularly the Japanese maquilas here in Mexico, many, many years ago. But I've just turned 60. And I said, I love Silicon Valley, I love high-tech, and it's all wonderful. But wealthy entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley, they go to Napa to retire, to take their large fortune and make it smaller. So I said, well, maybe I should follow them. And Napa's a really wonderful place, but this is going to be about Paso, but I'm increasingly going to be looking at Napa. This is really a work that came from a graduate student course. The three students, Craig Farshid, we're just master's students. And I told them, well, let's study something interesting. And they said, okay, let's study Paso Robles. And when they got done, I said, oh, there's something here. Let's write an article on this. And those sort of things happened, and it took 2.5, 3 years to get this thing done, but it's finally done. And I decided I'm going to have fun, and so I'm going to start to study the wine industry. Right, the fine wine industry. When I was young, it was the cheap wine industry that I experienced, but I'm going for the fine wine industry. So with that as a kind of an introduction as to how I got into this space, I'll talk a little bit about the paper. So the plan of the talk, I'm going to talk about the role of identity in culture goods clusters, Then I'm going to talk about the Paso Robles American Viticultural Area, AVA. It's like the AOCs in France, Appellation Originée Contrôlée. My French is from 4th grade, so please forgive my French. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the conventional analysis of clusters, the Porterian framework. And then I'm going to take that and think about identity. And it was particularly in Paso Robles, the identity became very obvious because there was an attempt at a schism. And so I'll talk a little bit about the schism. And with that, I'll conclude. I'll speak as distinctly as possible, but if you're having trouble, I can slow down. As I speak, I tend to go faster and faster and faster. So wave and tell me, Martin, please slow down if that's a problem. Okay, so the typical discussion of clusters we all know is the Porter Harvard Business Review article. Why do clusters exist? Why are they successful? Better access to employees, access to specialized information, complementarities, access to institutions, better motivation and measurement. And this is really, it's good as far as it goes. It's really a very valuable way. I start all of my classes with Porter's article, right? Just here are the 5 parts of cluster, blah, 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 blah. And it's great, but as we started to look at Paso, we said, well, this is all true, but there's something else going on. It's that something else that we're trying to get to in this article. And admittedly, it's not proof. It's a discursive article. It's like an essay. We have some evidence, but this is not, scientific proof a la the Administrative Science Quarterly. So it's kind of more to create discussion and thought about these issues. So there's a lot of cluster theory extensions. Richard Florida, my old colleague, I hear is coming here to Tijuana soon to speak. Peter Maskell. How many of you are familiar with this cluster literature? Are most of you sort of familiar with it? Okay, so most of you aren't. Oh, okay. Well, so why do clusters of industries that are doing similar things exist? And what are the economic advantages of having industries clustered? I say Silicon Valley and you go high tech. I say Wall Street and you go finance, right? So right? So that's the kind of, I say Napa, you think of wine, right? Clusters of industries. Why do they exist? What are the advantages? Why do industries cluster? Okay. And then people have gone on from that, talked about learning regions. So in these regions, in these clusters, learning goes on because you're doing the same thing, you're interacting. Michael Storper, local buzz, that there's this buzz. If you go to Napa Valley, people are talking about wine everywhere. You sit down and you hear people and they're talking about wine. You go to Silicon Valley and you sit on University Avenue in Palo Alto, and I've done this in the coffee shop, and somebody's talking about a high-tech deal right next to you. You can hear them. It's buzzing, right, about the industry. So Michael Storper's written about this, knowledge circulating in industries. He talked about untraded dependencies. Some of these dependencies, these interactions, aren't traded in the marketplace. They're just there, right, as a common good. It's a social good. Okay, so this stuff is really clearly very useful. It's useful for thinking about Paso. It's useful for thinking about Silicon Valley. But what struck me about AVAs is this other piece, this creation of identity that goes beyond just the local buzz, these untraded dependencies, but it's something more than that, and it can have value. And when I speak about value, I'm talking about market value, economic value. I'm not speaking about values in a moral sense. I'm speaking about this in a capitalist sense. Jorge knows I never speak about morality, except when I'm criticizing the American president. Anyway, so identity. The other thing to understand about identity, it's not just brand, right? It's not just branding, right? And I'll talk about why it's not just branding. If all you're trying to do is brand Paso, but you don't have some of the other aspects of identity, this is just advertising. And I'm going to argue it's more than advertising. And there's a social capital aspect to this, and you're all familiar with Putnam, but it's not the same as that. also. And there's a small geography literature on regions and identity. There's some management literature upon identity in firms, but much less the management literature is not as interested in regions. And so the citations I've put here are to the geography literature, which is starting to grow on identities, but is still quite small. The other place where identity is talked about is in the discussions of culture goods, right? Variety. The theater district in LA, Alan Scott writes about that. Others have written about that, and this goes back through Adorno, and this goes back this discussion of culture goods. And wine, of course, has, let's see, so I don't want to skip forward. I'm going to go through my. So Romanelli and Cassina, in an Organization Science article, wrote about how identity is constructed. And they argue that it's constructed in two ways. It's constructed internally within the group, but it also needs external validation. It's got to be outside the group. Someone's got to say that is something. You say Colef has an identity. If you guys all think it's an identity, but nobody outside knows anything about Colef, well, does it have an identity? Yeah, kind of. You've got a self-feeling, but nobody else knows. Nobody else cares, right? So, I mean, part of everything is how do you build this identity, right? And how do you acquire recognition? So you want to build a great university. You start publishing in international journals, et cetera, et cetera. You build an identity. So it's the same kind of concept. Corporations would do the same thing. But this external identity that we're talking about has to be validated by the market. Somehow the market's got to say, okay, you have an identity. We'll pay for this identity. It's worth something, at least from how I'm going to look at it. There are other aspects of identity, but I'm going to look here, I'm trying to look at the economic value of identity. Okay, so you think about wine. Wine has two manifestations. It's fermented grape juice. That's all it is, right? It's fermented grape juice. That's sort of one piece of it. But the other piece of it is this cultural product that conveys information. Right? Oh, Napa. Okay. Oh, Paso Robles. Oh, Guadalupe River. That means something to me, right? It evokes identity. It displays idiosyncratic knowledge. Well, you know, the wine sector, right? I can tell this is from Paso Robles. This is obviously not a cab from Napa or not a cab from Guadalupe River Valley, right? So it has that idiosyncratic knowledge, and part of that is in the terroir concept, the French terroir concept, right? It's the land and the sun and the water, et cetera, right? I'm being a little facetious here because I can't tell the difference, really, between a $250 bottle of wine and a $30 bottle of wine. I just can't tell the difference, right? I don't think. But if somebody says, I just drank a $250, I feel very uplifted, right? I feel, well, I'm better than I really am. But anyway, so you get the concept here. Okay, so this is Paso Robles. It's on Highway 1, north of Santa Barbara and north of San Luis Obispo on the main route. This is the boundaries of the AVA here. Okay, it's the boundaries of the AVA. And it's now developed some reputation nationally and perhaps internationally as a place where good wines are made. Okay. And I'll give you a little brief history. 1970s, what Paso was doing is it's a good place to grow grapes, right? The noble varieties, Cabs, Pinots, etc., Zinfandels in particular. And they exported high-quality grape juice, literally just juice, right, as I described that juice before, to Napa for blending, because in the United States, a Napa Valley wine or any AVA wine can have 15% that is not from the region. It's different from France, different from Italy. Each country has a different set of rules, right? And also Central Valley, that's Gallo, that's low-end wine. But Central Valley wine is so bad that, I shouldn't speak badly of Gallo, they give a lot of money to UC Davis, but anyway, that they were buying the grape juice from Paso and blending it into the low-quality Central Valley wine to give it a little bit better taste. Okay, so the growers could see all we're doing is we're exporting juice, right? And they wanted to increase their prices, their income. So they started to coalesce to build a brand. Well, what you need to build a brand in the wine industry is you need wineries. You need somebody to make the wine, otherwise all you've got is grape juice. And in 1983, they were granted American Viticultural Association. You go through the US government, probably in Mexico it's the same. The Mexican governments, they petition, the people in the region petition, and they go to the government and say, can you draw some boundaries? Within these boundaries, it's XYZ wine. Outside the boundaries, you can't call it XYZ wine, right? So an AVA was granted in 1983, and they started the Paso Robles Wine Festival in 1983, and it was a great success. People, particularly from LA. Paso Robles really services the LA market. That's probably its biggest service, is for the LA market. Those are the tourists that go there, the people who buy the wine. And it was a great success. And in 1992, they formed the Vintners and Growers Association. And over time, and it's described in the paper in greater detail, it starts to become a destination. People go there, and Paso Robles becomes a recognizable brand. Today, a Paso wine is considered a quite good wine. It wouldn't be really, it's not Napa or Alexander River, but it's a good wine. If you see a Paso for $9, $10, $12, $13, some of them go up much higher into the $100 to $150 range, so not really expensive, but quite expensive. You're getting a decent wine, and people started to recognize the brand, right? And the winery industry started to grow, and here's sort of the early wine industry. You see not much going on, sorry. And then you see this growth, and in 1993, it really starts to take off. These are winery foundations. These are founding of a winery. Right here, you could just see it take off. And the numbers down here are, that's sort of the end. Don't think about those. Also the economy tanks. When the economy tanks, wine formation of new wineries, which is, formation of new wineries, $1 to $5 million undertaking. So it's not expensive, but it's certainly not cheap. Okay, so that sort of gives you a history and shows you what happened. Now let's talk about clusters. Okay, so the Porter framework is the supplier base. So let me just, I'm skipping through this. There's a lot in this. It's a very long paper. So what you would expect in the Porterian framework, as you build a cluster, you start to build as suppliers, right? Suppliers to the wine industry, all sorts of suppliers, bottle makers, irrigation people, there's a whole set of things. Now, what's interesting about Paso is the supplier base remains weak, and it remains weak for a very good reason, because Napa, Sonoma is the center of the U.S. wine industry, and that's where all the suppliers are. My guess is even the Guadalupe River Valley, people are getting stuff out of the San Francisco area. It's probably not coming direct from France. It's probably because it's the oldest, most developed cluster, and so it got most of the big suppliers. So if you go into Napa on Highway 12, what you'll see is Lafite, Corks, you'll see all these Italian, French, and German wine industry suppliers. You won't see those in Paso. They just never showed up. Okay, so the supplier base remained weak. The other interesting thing that happened is they actually, in the paper I described how they reached out to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which is one of the state universities, agriculture oriented, very close to Paso, not in Paso, but very close by. And they reached out and they helped it develop a wine major, right? To develop trained employees. So this is the Porter framework. You reach out to public goods institutions and you start to create a supply of workers for your industry, right? This is very typical. The research is still sourced outside the region from UC Davis. I mean, UC Davis is, please, I don't want to sound arrogant here, but I'm going to be a little bit arrogant. In the wine area in the United States, it's by far the top institution, which is absolutely by far. We do the research for the wine industry, not only in the United States, but for the world, right? And we have probably the best enology and viticulture department in the world. The French would argue, but nobody else can argue. Only the French can argue. And they're much bigger with the CNRS. But anyway, so the research is still outsourced outside the region. So what you have is a cluster growing, but in a way, some parts of it are quite weak because it sources a lot of inputs from outside the region. And that will remain as long as Napa-Sonoma are the center of the US and probably North American wine industry. Okay, so, but here's the really interesting thing. Marianne Feldman, Janet Berkowitz, and someone else wrote a wonderful article that I truly recommend to about how clusters are created through human agency, through people, entrepreneurs, creating the industry. So if you look at the history that I describe in the paper, you'll actually see how Paso is created. It's out of kind of nothing, right? It's a place where they're just growing grapes and crushing them. Not even crushing them, they're just exporting. They're just exporting grape juice. So it's how is this created, right? So they're creating a supplier base to some degree. There is a supplier base, it's described in the paper, but it's weak. Cal Poly SLO, they're starting to create a set of employees, skilled employees. Research still out, so you can see all the Porter stuff coming together. But what I think is important is this other part, which is how they start to form an identity. They're not going to develop a supplier base like Napa-Sonoma. That's just not going to happen. Okay, so let's talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about cluster identity formation and build internal identity, the role of the Wine Country Alliance, external validation, wine ratings, newspaper articles, movie and TV series. I'm not going to talk about these, but they're all in the paper. And then how, when the identity is threatened, and I'll discuss the threat, how does the community respond to the identity threat? Okay. So the Local Industry Association is the Vintners and Growers Associations, formed in 1992, external, AVA formation, the wine festival. The wine festival is not so they can all sit around and drink. It's to bring tourists in and tell them about how great Paso wines are, right? So you have music and jazz and all that stuff, and people drink it and they go home and they say, oh, Paso, right? So, and this is an annual event. And then they had an internal events to encourage networking and interaction. But these are really important. How you create feeling, how you spread knowledge through the cluster, particularly as you're getting all the new entrants. Remember, new entrants are coming in. Well, you want those new entrants to produce a good wine, right? Because you don't want new entrants to come in and produce a bad wine, right? Because the economics of this is, let's say we have two wineries and she gets a Robert Parker 99. That's like super high rating. We're in the same AVA. I get a benefit from her getting a 99. Now, if I got a 75 and everybody around her has a 75, right, Paso's going to, that wine's awful, right? She got a 99, but who cares? It's just luck. But now if we all get into the 90s, right, on the rating system, now we're all better off. And I don't have the data because I couldn't get the data. You should actually expect to see that capitalized in the cost of the land. You actually should be but anyway, she has an interest in me doing better, right? I have an interest in her doing better. We're competitors, of course, but on the other hand, we're competing with Napa, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the really important thing. So you have events that are these networking events to spread information, and we have interviews with the people saying, yeah, new people are coming in, we've got to train them, we've got, got to get them upgraded, right? So that's the really one of the economics here of this internal dynamics. Okay, and the other thing the Local Industry Association does is undertakes advertising. So the industry evolves, the industry association evolves, and in the evolution is where you see more of the identity creation. And that is when you start to get the restaurant upgrading, the hotel industry, to get the restaurants and hotel industry. Now they are located there. They have a great interest in advertising how great Paso wines are, but they're also serving the wine to discriminating customers, and the discriminating customer goes, I don't want this. You can believe that the restaurant owner is going to go talk and say, you're producing bad wine. I can't serve your wine here because I won't get my customers back. So it's this layering. So there's the upstream suppliers, upstream if you think of a river upstream, and there's these downstream. And it's the downstream, I argue, that's really the most important in Paso, because they start to build this identity further. So people go up there, they go to the restaurant, they stay in the hotel, et cetera, and they join the wine club, right? This winery or that winery's wine club, every month you get wine, et cetera. So we did a lot of that. The local wine shops. So local wine shops are really key. There'll be these wine shops are where particularly small brands can sell, and this has really gone far further in Napa than in Paso. But it's happening in Paso, and in Napa this has gone, and there are wine shops that are just absolutely awesome. I spend most of my time in Napa, but Paso's going through this same process. Okay, and so these constituents up here have an interest in quality upgrading and strengthening the identity. So the industry association says, we're no longer the Vintners and Growers Association, right? No longer just the winery and growers. We're this wine country alliance. I mean, just think about it. Alliance. What are they saying? We're in this together, all of us. This is really an important part of this identity formation process that I talk about, and the deepening and strengthening of the cluster overall economically. Okay, so this is just Wine Spectator ratings. They're downloadable, easy to get. It's a pain in the butt, but if you have students, you can have them do it. sorry if you students here. We don't take advantage of you. I would never think of exploiting my students because I'm a nice guy. Anyway, yeah, and you can see some drops here, and these were weather related, but you could sort of see the trajectory of improvement, and you can see that. The other piece of it, of course, is this is the mean rating. Oh, that was the number rating, right? That's the number rated. So the other thing about a cluster is the more you have rated, right, that's showing that you're on the map, right? People bother to rate it, right? So you get an increase, and they do pretty well. I mean, there's a mean increase here. It kind of leveled off, but there's sort of a mean increase here. But you sort of see Paso sort of coming on the map here, right? From this period, you just see it come on the map. Okay, so what was very interesting in Paso's a big region. You saw that big map. And there's a west side of 101 and an east side. And over time, on the west side, you've got a lot of the boutique wineries. Boutique wineries are very often wealthy people who really want ratings, and they don't care so much about money. So you got a division started to develop because the west side got more high ratings than the east side. East side is drier, the west side is a little closer to the coast, has a little bit chalky hills, et cetera, et cetera. The terroir is somewhat different. Remember, when we talk about these clusters, right, these are socially constructed. Though they talk about terroir and all that, you look at Napa, and Napa has so many actually different microclimates, and they mean that the wines are different from different parts. Now, so part of this is it's a social construction. It is not, as many people say, there's a lot of physical discussion, but it is a socially constructed. And the Paso AVA changed over time as it grew to take in other wineries, which is an absolute sign that there's a social construction going on here. Even the French districts are socially constructed. They're far older, many of them, but Champagne district just got extended. They brought more land in the Champagne district. They need more grapes because Champagne was doing well, I guess, during the bubble. During the stock market bubble, everybody drinks champagne, right? So anyway, let's see. Did I do this right? I'm going the right direction. Okay. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. I'm sorry. I've gotten myself backwards here. Okay, yes. So Paso Robles achieves recognition. So the identity value of Paso is going up, and the west side starts to say, we want to leave. We want to leave and develop, we want to call it the West Side, Paso Robles West Side AVA. So we're going to split the AVAs, which is really a big issue if you have an identity, is now you're going to have a split. right? And part of the paper discusses this. We had a lot more discussion, but it was so long they made us take pieces out. But I just want to talk about this because this is what makes you understand that the identity exists, right? So if COLEF decides, well, we're going to divide, building 3 and 4 are going to be called COLEF something, and 2 and 3 business, somebody might be happy, get rid of those guys. But other people might say, well, you're going to destroy the identity of COLEF. Now there's going to be COLEF North and COLEF South. I think that's Baja California, California. Anyway, East and West, right? So you can see there where the identity issue becomes really something because you're now going to divide the identity. And what's this one? Oh, there it is. Oh, sorry. I was looking at the other one. So here are the number of spectator reviews by vintage year, West Side, East Side. And you start to see the reasoning is why the West Side might want to leave. Because the West Side's being evaluated more, and see, I had the ratings too. The West Side's ratings are higher also. I think I didn't bring that slide, I'm sorry. I was cutting slides. Is that too many? Anyway. So you can see the difference. Now there's going to be a schism, right? And the position, so what we did is we took all of the actors in the schism and we mapped them out and tried to find who were the schismatics, right? Who wanted to schism. And here, this didn't make it into the paper, but I think it's kind of interesting. This is West Side, this is East Side. These 3 players, very important players, were on the schismatic side. And these are linkages. You worked with people you worked at this wine, so all these are linkages. What we did is we started to look at the network.
Which one is winery?
These are all winemakers at wineries, okay? And these are their histories. Where did they work? Okay, and the lines are when you work together, right? So these are who wrote letters during the schism, right? And what happened was the schism becomes a really brutal fight, right? And some people defect from the schismatics. And it's these were key wineries who were networked in. They defected and went back to the let's keep one Paso Robles, right? So there's a fight about identity here. If you read and discuss, people won't talk about this hardly. The Wine Country Alliance, you talk to them, they don't want to talk about it, right? This is only 5 years ago, it's 2007, right? So what we did is we tried to say, well, who stayed where in the schism? Most of these are small boutique wineries that were coming in later, weren't as attached to the Wine Country Alliance and to the identity of the community. These guys joined and then they quit. When they quit, the whole thing collapsed. The schism collapsed. They come to a compromise. There's a resolution. Those most linked defect from the schismatics. There's a resolution. The identity is held in place, right? The resolution is sub-AVAs. So you have to label Paso Robles, and then below that you can say, Smoky Gap, or these different sub-AVAs. I don't know if they have them in Guadalupe River. This is sort of typical. But this is how it was solved. The resolution is then codified. The state legislature passes a law. If you're in the Paso Robles AVA, you must say Paso Robles on your wine. You cannot. You have no choice but to do that. So the battle is ended. It's codified at the state government level, which is kind of where you'd expect. I mean, once you get a codification at the government level, it's over. It's going to be very, very hard to change. So the identity is preserved. Everybody is now constrained by the state. And let's see, it moves forward. So I hope I've convinced you, and I don't think I have with this very quick discussion. First of all, identity is not equivalent to culture. I'm not arguing that's culture here. It's something different, okay? And it isn't culture due to its dual internal and external manifestation. You can have a culture that's just internal. Nobody recognizes, nobody pays attention to it, but you've got your culture. It's culture, right? But this identity has to be validated outside. Okay, boundaries are important for identity. So when you have a Silicon Valley, there's an identity there. It's a little hard to say who's in and who's out. But I would argue that it's going to be hard to do, but you might be able to see this identity in stock prices, initial public stock offerings, venture capital investing. If you're in Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is a socially constructed, you might be able to get more venture capital. And there's some evidence, if you put a dummy variable in Silicon Valley or outside Silicon Valley, you'd be able to get more capital, raise more capital. Or you could do a dummy variable, and people have done this on initial public stock offerings. So you should be able to see it in other places, but when you have a very clear boundary, these are really very powerful for creating identity. Okay, and these social networks that I demonstrated earlier are critical for the identity creation and the solidarity, right? And solidarity is why I would help her improve her wine, because we have a solidarity of being internal. We're here in Paso together. So that's sort of a very quick sort of run through of the paper. If you need the paper, I'm sure Oscar or someone can offer to you, or Sarah. And with that, I'll just open it. I guess Sarah's going to make a few comments, and then we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Martín. Le doy la palabra sin más a la colega Sara Martínez, que siendo de casa no necesita presentación. Todos sabemos que es una excelente académica y una gran persona, y no tomo más tiempo para darle la palabra.
Pues muchas gracias por la presentación de todas maneras, Oscar, y sobre todo gracias por la invitación a estar aquí, porque realmente para mí es pues realmente una gran oportunidad y una distinción de alguna manera estar comentando este trabajo, y por dos razones. Una, efectivamente, por quien ha trabajado en él, y en segundo lugar porque esto es una de las líneas de investigación que hemos estado desarrollando en el COLEF desde hace cerca de 8 años. Y creo que una de las cosas más interesantes que van a ver aquí es que hay resultados que son muy consistentes, o de alguna manera que van en la misma dirección, desde una visión más de sociología, como se estaba diciendo, y bueno, pues ahora sí que una visión desde economía o desde desarrollo. Realmente, si ven el título de lo que yo estoy presentando, no pensarían que es algo que tiene que ver con economía, identidad, territorio y acción colectiva. Y sin embargo, cuando estamos hablando de desarrollo local, desarrollo endógeno, son factores que están realmente explicando el valor que generamos económicamente en lo que sería la estructura productiva que trabajamos de manera más tradicional en economía. Dicho esto, sí me gustaría también decir cómo empezó el trabajo aquí sobre el vino, porque de alguna manera, efectivamente, empezó con una tesis de maestría en desarrollo regional precisamente, y un poco no trabajando sobre los factores económicos, sino los factores de cohesión de un grupo productivo. Aparte de eso, bueno, pues supongo que también yo tengo una tendencia natural a trabajar en este tema, porque soy mitad española, mitad francesa, entonces imaginarán que tengo vino en las venas en lugar de sangre casi, con lo cual ayuda mucho también a interesarse por el asunto, y supongo que tiene que ver con que uno se quede en Baja California. Bueno, sin más preámbulos, a mí me gustaría empezar un poco con una formulación un poco teórica de qué elementos encontramos en este trabajo. Realmente es un placer leer el paper, o el artículo deberíamos decir aquí, porque permite abrir muchas preguntas, permite trabajar otra vez desde diferentes disciplinas, pero es muy clara es muy claro qué es lo que estamos discutiendo y cómo lo podemos abordar desde diferentes instrumentos, desde diferentes niveles, desde diferentes perspectivas, y que de alguna manera esa conjunción de perspectivas nos ayuda a poder abordar un objeto real, un sujeto real de estudio, que en la mayoría de los casos cuando nos vamos con una se nos escapa el objeto del sujeto y acabamos quedándonos con un discurso más teórico, más fuera de la realidad. Bueno, ¿por qué identidad, territorio y acción colectiva? Y aquí voy a tratar de irme ya muy rápido porque si no esto va a durar horas. Y básicamente...
Muy rápido para la traducción.
Okay. Rápido o conciso, mejor dicho. Fundamentalmente, la idea de clúster, sistemas productivos y agrupamientos se empezó a estudiar con variables económicas. Sí, la idea de clúster, sistemas productivos y agrupamientos se empezó a trabajar desde una idea económica y un poco porque las variables que podemos medir en las relaciones muchas veces son los intercambios, que tienen un carácter económico. Pero efectivamente las motivaciones están más allá de lo que es estrictamente esos intercambios económicos, en algunos de los casos, porque no podemos encontrar un patrón en el que surgen clústeres o sistemas productivos o agrupamientos en todos los lugares donde los esperaríamos. Y no todos los que se tratan de promover en los lugares que cumplen las condiciones funcionan. Entonces, algo se está escapando.
Okay, and then I'll just try.
Okay. ¿Qué elementos tenemos como elementos centrales en la discusión que me gustaría ver aquí un poco en la presentación que se estuvo haciendo? Tenemos un aspecto de crecimiento económico, muy relacionado con las políticas económicas y lo que entendemos como generación de riqueza. Si ven, una de las partes en que se reconocen normalmente sistemas, identidades, tiene una posición económica importante, sobre todo si partimos de la visión porteriana, de alguna manera muy ligada a competitividad. Segundo punto, tenemos elementos de redistribución social y equidad entre grupos y en el tiempo. Normalmente, cuando estamos hablando de estos grupos y cuando vamos un poco más allá de lo que es el clúster porteriano, ya me gustaría hablar más de clúster territoriales, de alguna manera, empezamos a tener esa idea de garantizar condiciones aceptables de vida y sobre todo porque empiezan a jugar los mecanismos de solidaridad. Entonces, un elemento de polarización en un espacio empieza a generar problemas para el punto 1 de crecimiento económico y empieza a generar incertidumbres muy claras. Y tenemos un tercer punto que es esa redistribución territorial. ¿Qué nos pasa? Efectivamente, en el caso, por ejemplo, de Paso Robles, tenemos una primera ABA, un territorio que se delimita y empieza a haber una serie de características específicas de actores o de grupos de actores en ese territorio que empiezan a distinguir áreas dentro del territorio. Entonces, vamos a jugar con el equilibrio o la solidaridad entre los actores, pero vamos a jugar con ese factor territorial también de identidades por características físicas, de ubicación, lo que ustedes quieran. Con esos tres elementos me gustaría que enfocásemos la discusión desde la perspectiva de desarrollo endógeno, porque de alguna manera muchos de los elementos que se están presentando podemos verlos desde una idea de proceso de crecimiento y un cambio estructural en los tres elementos que vimos antes. Es decir, vamos a tener, y hay crecimiento o no crecimiento económico, más bien una reorganización, una redefinición de quiénes son, qué hacen y cómo lo hacen. Fundamentalmente, es decir, una respuesta a cómo nos ubicamos en un modelo de desarrollo más general, entendido ese modelo de desarrollo como un camino en el tiempo hacia unos objetivos como grupo. Objetivos centrales, efectivamente, bueno, pues un poco alineado con lo anterior, tenemos el bienestar económico, obviamente las empresas quieren crecer y ascender en la cadena de valor de alguna manera, ser más productivas, pero tenemos esos factores sociales y culturales de la comunidad en los que bueno, pues esas entidades empiezan a exigir otra serie de beneficios, de externalidades. Por ejemplo, efectivamente estábamos diciendo, una empresa funciona mucho mejor, genera una serie de externalidades que van a llevar un bienestar a los demás. Y en términos de la construcción cultural, de alguna manera, empiezan a generarse, o cultural, identitaria, sociológica, y no quiero confundirme, aquí hay expertos en el tema que saben mucho más de eso que yo, pero empezamos a ver otra forma de generar consensos y otro tipo de consensos sobre las reglas en ese espacio, en ese sistema, en ese grupo. Yo creo que podríamos hablar de 3 ámbitos de acción en la plática que acaban de oír. Tenemos un ámbito económico muy claro, tenemos un ámbito sociocultural, es decir, las redes se reorganizan, los acuerdos son otros entre los actores, empieza a haber mecanismos de solidaridad que antes no había, incluso son una nueva forma de acuerdo político de alguna manera en términos de institucionalizar ciertas cosas, formal o no formalmente, pero generamos esas instituciones en términos de acuerdos y generamos diferentes mecanismos de participación que explican la evolución también del sistema. Y ahí, bueno, pues lo que sí podríamos hacer es verlo desde un punto de vista más teórico o trabajarlo como un caso. Aquí esto también me interesa ver un poco el punto porque efectivamente tenemos en el caso de esta propuesta una discusión teórica subyacente en términos de cómo podemos definir las identidades desde esos factores intangibles que podemos encontrar de diferente manera en las formas de organización, en las formas de diálogo, en las formas de interacción. Y tenemos pues, esa corriente empírica a la que creo que pertenece Paso Robles y pertenece mucho del Valle de Guadalupe en términos de casos exitosos. Nos quedan 5 minutos y en esos 5 minutos me gustaría hablarles de paralelismos y diferencias entre uno y otro caso, un poco dentro de este mismo contexto del que estamos hablando ahora. Primer punto central, estamos hablando de procesos en el tiempo. Creo que una de las cosas que no podemos perder de vista aquí es la maduración del sistema y creo que de alguna forma cuando hablamos de los clúster Porter a veces se olvida un poco esa dimensión más histórica de construcción de tiempo y es sorprendente cómo si revisamos los 2 casos Paso Robles empieza antes, empieza prácticamente 20 años antes prácticamente. Guadalupe, que ahora ya no es Guadalupe, si les decimos Guadalupe se van a enojar porque ya son 5 valles, es Ojos Negros, es Guadalupe, es San Antonio, pero bueno, digamos que los viticultores baja californianos empiezan más tarde, pero los pasos de consolidación son muy parecidos. Tenemos un primer momento en que hay 8 casas, 2004 se identifican 8 casas registradas, y lo que hacen es fundamentalmente intercambiar desde barricas, porque efectivamente hay muchos problemas con construir la cadena, digamos, al estilo Porter. Intercambian barricas, intercambian enólogos, los comparten, se venden uva y todo lo demás. Empiezan a generar vinos boutique, es un poco la idea porque hay un gran productor aquí que es Cheto. Baja California es 90% de la producción de vino en el país, Cheto explica cerca del 60% de eso y el resto son pequeños productores. Bueno, lo interesante aquí es que los pequeños productores de esas 8 casas, unas Cheto, 7 son las otras y son pequeñas, son abajo de 2.500 cajas de producción anual, son los que empiezan a detonar el movimiento hacia un producto de calidad, por ejemplo, que es lo que empieza a generar realmente el mecanismo identitario del que se está hablando en el paper para el caso de la vitivinicultura en Baja California. Empiezan a generar los vinos boutique y como un mecanismo para competir con el grande, que efectivamente es un poco como Galo, que tiene una producción masiva pero no orientada a calidad. Y curiosamente ese segmento más pequeño de la producción es el que marca en los siguientes 5 o 6 años la dinámica de evolución del sector. Cosas... Sí, el modelo de desarrollo del sector en los últimos años. En términos de los puntos que se expusieron para Paso Robles, coincidencias, fundamentalmente crecimiento del sector. Empezamos con 8 casas en 2004, actualmente son 57 registradas, entonces incluyendo el periodo de crisis, es de los sectores que a pesar de la crisis ha seguido una tendencia de crecimiento constante. Entonces ahí de alguna manera tenemos efectivamente que ese mecanismo está generando cierta seguridad. Y respecto a los puntos de identidad, bueno, les comenté en clase antes de venir, pero por ejemplo, actualmente es sector emblemático en Baja California. Es decir, en el caso del vino en Baja California, creo que en este momento es más fuerte el reconocimiento externo que el interno en términos de la identidad. Y en las placas de los carros tienen las uvas del sector productivo del vino, cuando es un sector que en términos, digamos, absolutos no explica la mayor parte de la producción del Estado. Con esto, ¿qué estamos viendo? Estamos viendo un factor que aquí sí creo es diferente, cómo incide el contexto en términos del gobierno. Aquí no tenemos la definición de ABAS, de regiones cerradas por el gobierno, pero lo que sí hay es otros instrumentos a través de la Secretaría, por ejemplo, Zagarpa, que es la Secretaría de, bueno, que se dedica a todo lo que es agricultura, pesca, de una estructura de asociación que se llaman sistemas productivos. Hay un sistema Producto Vid. For wine. Y lo que pasa con eso es que se logra desde fuera dar ese sustento legal que se estaba diciendo para evitar los cismas internos. El paralelismo en los dos casos va hasta el punto de que los cismas que se estaban presentando en 2007 allá están empezando a presentarse en este momento. Y la forma de resolverlos ha tenido mucho que ver con, el acceso a recursos externos por parte del gobierno que permiten consolidar la actividad del sector, por ejemplo. Es decir, la estrategia de los que quieren evitar la fragmentación ha sido demostrar con insumos tangibles, como son financiamiento público, que esa unidad, esa identidad permite unos beneficios extras que como individuos las empresas no estaban logrando. Entonces, en ese sentido, creo que podríamos hablar de una institucionalización de alguna manera de esa identidad, porque lo que están haciendo es conjugar una serie de necesidades, una serie de visiones de lo que es el sector para generar instrumentos específicos que garanticen una unidad. Y aquí me gustaría romper un poco la visión sectorial, aunque estamos hablando del vino, porque esa unidad empezó a tomar un carácter más territorial o de un clúster más horizontal, porque efectivamente empezó, igual que en nuestros colegas del norte, a incorporar otros sectores como es el sector turismo. Ya las casas vinícolas no se conciben como un vendedor de vino, se conciben como un lugar de cata, como un lugar donde se pueden hacer eventos. Hicieron un museo del vino en el Valle. Un poco empiezan a tener empiezan a asumir un papel de actividades culturales, donde incluso promueven conciertos, promueven otra serie de cosas, y empiezan a tener otro papel en términos de esa construcción más apegada al territorio, más embedded de alguna manera, como diríamos, más arraigada, en buscar mecanismos de capacitación de la población local que está fuera del sector y que no tiene otras formas de empleo, a través de la Escuela de Enología que se creó por parte de la UABC en Ensenada, y a través sobre todo de escuelas técnicas, porque ahí hay mucha población que realmente no tendría una capacidad para ir directamente a un grado universitario, entonces los están tratando de incorporar como aprendices y otra serie de funciones básicas en lo que serían los cultivos. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Quiere decir de alguna manera que también hubo una identificación de que esa identidad iba más allá de lo que son sus actividades productivas o las propias casas, y empezaron a detectar una necesidad de incorporar otra población, y realmente no es una cuestión altruista, tiene mucho que ver con una serie de problemas de seguridad, de desempleo alrededor, que estaba generando problemas para la propia estructura productiva, en que había robos, había una serie de otras circunstancias. Pero de alguna manera son elementos que lo que van haciendo es consolidar esa identidad en principio originada como sectorial o productiva hacia una identidad más amplia como región en un sentido territorial. Entonces creo que esto nos abre realmente muchas preguntas sobre muchos de los elementos intangibles que estamos viendo y que sí se identifica, que explican porque se aglomeran las actividades, se aglomeran los actores, pero que todavía, bueno, pues realmente podemos identificar por efectos que eso está teniendo, pero es muy difícil identificar de otra manera a partir de su propia naturaleza, de su origen o de sus características. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Sara, por los comentarios, y gracias a Diana Peláez por la traducción de los comentarios para el profesor Kenny. Supongo que Martín querrá comentar algunos de los aspectos que ha tratado Sara, pero primero les pediría si tienen comentarios o preguntas para la presentación del profesor Kenny. Puede ser en español o, si lo prefieren, en inglés u otro idioma. Por favor, Laura.
Pues, Kenny, mucho gusto en saludarte y escuchar tu conferencia, y bienvenido al colegio. Y muchas gracias, Sara, por tus comentarios. Gracias, Diana, por la traducción, y a todos. Pues me parece, para los que trabajamos temas de identidad, escuchar a los economistas hablar sobre los temas de identidad, pues, muy interesante, ¿no?, esta perspectiva. A mí me quedan algunas dudas, seguramente tienen que ver con mi dominio del inglés también, entonces tal vez no, hay muchas cosas que no entendí, tal vez ahora podemos, si tú las puedes aclarar, y también está relacionado con la presentación de Sara. Esta perspectiva de la identidad, ligado a un sector, ¿no?, sobre un territorio específico. Tanto tú como Sara más ampliamente hacia el territorio, lo están planteando más en términos de la construcción de la identidad, en términos de la unidad, ¿no? O sea, lo que une a estos actores en clúster o a estos actores alrededor de un territorio. Sin embargo, uno de los temas más importantes en el estudio de las identidades asociadas al territorio o a sectores es observar las disputas y las heterogeneidades entre los actores, porque finalmente la unidad que encontramos al final es el resultado de muchas negociaciones internas y muchos mecanismos de inclusión y de exclusión, con referentes simbólicos muy importantes, y lo que observamos finalmente como unidades construidas, como emblemas, digamos, emblemas de la identidad del clúster o del territorio, digamos, el emblema sería el signo, ¿no?, que une a este conjunto de personas relacionadas a un sector o a un territorio, son el resultado. Pero la perspectiva del tema de las disputas simbólicas y las bases de la diferenciación entre estos actores es muy, muy relevante. Entonces, yo me quedaba con dudas sobre esta heterogeneidad de los actores que tú describías en el clúster, que creo que lo entendí un poco, pero creo que lo desarrollabas un poco alrededor, por ejemplo, de los sismas. No sé si por ahí, aquí nosotros tratábamos de entender qué era el término que estabas utilizando, y si solamente esas disputas o esos sismas parecían más en relación a las bases económicas de la producción, pero si había también referentes de formas de vista y visiones distintas sobre esa identidad, finalmente. Un poco me llamaba la atención lo que decía Sara, que en el Valle de Guadalupe la idea de identidad surge de los pequeños productores, no de las grandes empresas, no de Cheto, creo que es el único, no sé quién más está en el Valle, pero entonces pareciera que esas diferencias, esas heterogeneidades tienen mucho que ver con finalmente qué se impone, y a lo mejor no terminan imponiéndose estos pequeños, sino más bien excluidos sus visiones o sus proyectos al final en lo que nosotros observamos como unidad. No sé, pregunta.
No, está bien, muchas gracias, Laura. Nada más, a mí no me gusta que hablen mal de mis amigos. Martín no es economista, es sociólogo. Gracias. ¿Alguien más? Por favor, hay oportunidad para una o dos intervenciones más antes de regresarle la palabra al profesor Kenny. Por favor, Joana, en el micrófono mejor.
Profesor Kenny, me gustó mucho la presentación, la disfruté bastante. Una pregunta un poco, no técnica, pero sí histórica en cuanto al cómo surge el clúster del Paso. Tiene que ver si hubo ciertas iniciativas ya medianamente consolidadas que fungieron como backbones del clúster para que surgiera, digamos, la iniciativa colectiva de llegar más allá, de establecer el ABA y toda esta cuestión. Es todo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Joana. ¿Alguien más? Por favor, Cheryl.
Sí, bueno, la pregunta es, me llama la atención sobre todo de los comentarios de la doctora Sara, el hecho de que comente que el modelo está impulsado principalmente por los pequeños productores, y me surgen como algunas dudas de qué tanto realmente ellos pueden ser los que impulsen y realmente no impongan este modelo por sobre los intereses de las grandes empresas que tienen más del 90% de dominio de la producción y de la toma de decisiones en ese sector específico.
Muy bien, si les parece vamos a tomar esta ronda y tendremos oportunidad de una segunda ronda de intervenciones. Yo le pediría ahora al profesor Kenny que pues conteste algunas de las preguntas y comentarios, por favor.
Okay, Laura. No, I'm not an economist. I'm considered a lapsed sociologist, perhaps, or a Marxist economist who is quite interested in production and the economics. But to call me, I'm not an economist exactly. I don't think I'm a sociologist. The question you ask is obviously a very good question, and I think, as Sarah said, part of this struggle, the East Side, West Side schism, was actually the East Side had larger wineries. They were older and larger. And the West Side were these smaller boutique wineries. So there was that struggle. Obviously, in my story, there are labor struggles that are not here at all. Struggles around labor, and probably you have similar issues. Environmental struggles are not here, though. I'm not as familiar with Paso, the work we're doing on Napa. Napa has gone completely California certified organic farmers, the highest level of organic that you can get, not the US government level, but a much higher level. There was a struggle around that, but part of it is when you're selling bottles of wine, nothing under $25, most in the $150 range, a little bit of cost for organic is not relevant. But I think the identity struggles were clearly the small boutique later entrants versus the earlier entrants, and not everybody in Paso sort of joined. There's some people who are not in the Wine Country Alliance. One of the very best winemakers who's got the highest ratings, makes isosceles, is not in. He's never been in. He didn't care. So these in the United States, these are voluntary organizations. In France, they're far less voluntary. I don't know in the Mexico case, but if the value of your product is, as I said, based on partially on how she does and how he does, then many of these struggles, what are you struggling about? What would you be struggling against? There's nothing to be, in a sense, against, because all of you will go up together, or you will sink together. Not everybody. You can probably, if you're very good, you might be able to stand out as the quality of the region falls. But for most people, it is partly economic, but it's also partly social, I mean, as sort of the porter, we compare each other because we're right next door. And if she's doing better than I, you know, it's the story of, oh my gosh, I want to compete with her. I want to do as well or better than she. So there are these constant struggles because we're also in an economic competition, she and I. So it's constant. But in this particular case, it can be a positive, you know, it's a positive feedback loop. This might be different in other cases, but I think it's because the region identifies and creates your identity because it is a legal region, right? And if she starts to cheat, for example, she brings in, instead of 15%, she starts to bring in Central Valley grapes at 25%, I'm going to be watching that, and I will report her to the government. The U.S. government will enforce that. They will punish her. So there's this outside punishment mechanism too, because there are a set of rules. So the particular struggles there were, I think, between the west side and the smaller versus the larger east side. But as I showed, that was resolved through the sub-AVA mechanism. So I think there will be struggles with labor. Those are different. They're not in my story. Labor's just out of my story. Period. It's out of my story. There were struggles about, so Paso, a lot of that land was used for other agricultural purposes. It's now going into wine. I mean, in Napa, this conversion has been complete. So if you were growing other products, you were either bought out, pushed out, gotten out. So that's one struggle. The other struggle is young winemakers coming up. This is more in Napa than Paso, because Paso still has relatively inexpensive wine. Young winemakers coming up can't buy land, so they can't become entrepreneurs. So they go to Alexander Valley, so there's that issue too, how far up you can go in the hierarchy. So there's a labor struggle there. Winemakers, so there's owners and winemakers. Sometimes the winemaker's an owner, but sometimes they're not. So you're a winemaker now, you want to start your own winery. As land prices are driven up, you can't do that. So there are tensions all over, but I think the story I'm telling is how a set of rules and a set of mutual interests sort of cover up those tensions, or make those tensions go away, or make them manageable. So that would be sort of my first answer. So to your question, the initiatives in the early days, what was clear in Paso, as was clear in Napa earlier. Napa, it's Mondavi. You've probably heard the name, Mondavi. I mean, the reason you've heard the name is because he, and there are two others, I'm blocking their name, in Napa, really drove in the post-war period that upgrading process. If you talk about Silicon Valley, people talk about Frederick Terman, the provost of Stanford, and his role. So there are these leaders, and in Paso there were Herman Schwartz, Gary Eberly. They were there, and they said, we need to take this to another level. So I think it's there are leaders, and they operate not only for their own good, but for the social good. I mean, social good in the sense of we're going to improve this place and make it economically more valuable. There are always losers in any of these processes. So there were leaders, and my guess is Sarah will give you a name or two in Guadalupe River Valley that were really key persons that were thinking not only of themselves and their benefit, though they would benefit, but also of the benefit of the community. So I think that's a really important part of these processes, to have these leaders that are seeing themselves as more than just their own individual benefit. And in Paso, we identified in the paper, there were about 3 of them. They're the ones who pushed creating the AVA. They're the ones who wanted the wine festival as a way of building the region up. And these leaders, I think, are really important. And they're important not only in wine industry clusters, but in other industrial clusters, particularly those that enter global class or become visible. And I think that's why the external story is so important. because you need that external visibility, or all you're doing is producing grape juice. I mean, you can't sell it for anything, you can't upgrade it, you can't add value. So I think that's that external piece that's very important. Did I get to everyone's questions? Okay.
Había una que se
I think
refería
Sarah's got some answers.
que te preguntaron en este momento.
Yo, y un poco respondiendo a Laura también, yo creo que ahí efectivamente el punto es donde se tratan las diferencias. Y yo, para el caso del Valle de Guadalupe, lo resumiría en la ropa sucia se lava en casa. Sí hay muchas diferencias dentro, pero no te dejan verlas. Y es un poco lo que también decía Martín. Si tú les preguntas y no eres alguien que ya trabajó con ellos, no van a reconocer las diferencias. Porque de alguna manera el beneficio que están derivando de aparecer como una unidad en términos de negociación con otros actores es mucho mayor que el costo que para ellos tiene en estos momentos distinguirse del grupo de alguna forma. Es decir, probablemente tiene que ver con que sus objetivos generales son suficientemente coincidentes o su visión general es suficientemente coincidente como que en este momento para ellos no tiene un costo sumarse a la decisión general en la mayoría de los casos. ¿Qué está pasando? Y un poco respondiendo de una vez también a la pregunta de Cheryl, el liderazgo de los pequeños. Una de las cuestiones por las que empezó ese liderazgo de los pequeños es precisamente porque la identidad vinícola de Cheto no les convenía. Y no les convenía porque hay casi una visión romántica de la producción de vino, que empezó ahí con esas casas que hacían vinos boutique y que respondían a un grupo que tenía un interés no primariamente económico en tener una casa que fuese económicamente productiva, sino de alguna manera generar un producto de alta calidad y posicionarse en ciertos mercados. Y eso tiene que ver con una primera etapa en que los que fundan las casas vinícolas son ciertos enólogos. Entonces, casi un interés como de un académico, por llamarlo de alguna manera, en que quiere mejorar un producto, tiene un interés en hacerlo. Parte del cisma que hay ahora, retomando las palabras de Martín, aquí, es que encuentras tres generaciones ahora de casas. Encuentras las más antiguas, que eran una tradición artesanal, toda la que todos conocemos, derivada de los rusos y todo lo demás, que tienen una visión casi de producción de subsistencia local. O sea, sí venden, pero localmente no tienen tanto interés en generar un producto de calidad, sino bueno, eso es parte de su, digamos, idiosincrasia local, es muy para ellos y no les importa ese referente externo o ese posicionamiento externo. Tienes un grupo intermedio que son estos pequeños que empezaron a mover esta idea de identidad, que lo que quieren es una posición de calidad, les interesa un nicho de calidad. No están tan interesados en los beneficios derivados de la empresa y en poder hacerse ricos, crecer y demás, como mantener un estatus en términos de la calidad del producto y generar vinos que están ganando premios. Y de hecho, bueno, pues hay ya casi 200 premios ganados internacionalmente, hay toda una trayectoria en ese sentido y que puedes ubicar muy bien en esas casas que son, digamos, la etapa intermedia de crecimiento. Y hay una tercera generación que es más reciente, son casas que tienen 2-3 años y ahí sí son realmente empresarios. Entonces tienen una visión mucho más de efectivamente utilizar la calidad, pero la calidad como un medio para ir ganando mercado y empezar a ampliar, digamos, su competitividad en el mercado nacional, en el mercado internacional. Para estos últimos es mucho más importante esa cuestión de identidad hacia afuera, porque es realmente un mecanismo de negociación en términos de apoyos públicos, de posicionamiento, de negociación y de poder generar, ahora sí, los beneficios también que hay en los clústeres estilo Porter en términos de la cadena de valor, de insumos y todo lo demás. ¿Por qué? Porque todavía no es una industria suficientemente grande como para generar toda la cadena de valor aquí. No tiene sentido tener aquí productores de corcho, productores de botellas y demás, porque no son suficientes ellos como para que eso tuviese sentido. Entonces siguen teniendo que trabajar agrupándose para ese tipo de cosas. Creo que de alguna manera esos tres momentos lo que están haciendo ahora es redefinir la identidad y redefinir el modelo. ¿Por qué ganaron la partida de alguna manera a los pequeños? Porque, y aquí en los temas del doctor Carrillo, porque fueron muy innovadores. Y lo que empezó a pasar es que, digamos que el sistema tradicional cheto, calidad de vino X, al principio, estaba estancado. Y esta gente percibe una oportunidad en competir con vinos extranjeros, que eran los que estaban ganando el mercado nacional incluso, teniendo productos de mucha calidad. Entonces encuentran ese hueco que Cheto no estaba cubriendo y eso les permite accesar al mercado nacional y de alguna manera brincar al mercado internacional. Y a partir de ahí se vuelven el modelo de éxito. Entonces incluso Cheto empieza a generar los vinos boutique, que ahora todos sabemos que hay muy buenos vinos en Cheto también, pero que es la colección boutique de Cheto, y empieza a generarse un modelo mixto. Pero otra vez, los dos contribuyen a modificar esa identidad hacia un modelo de desarrollo de otra manera en que todos están obteniendo beneficios, básicamente. Entonces, un poco, no es que no existan los problemas internos, y sí hay identidades muy, muy diferentes, incluso porque ellos mismos dicen que es una de las producciones que es imposible estandarizar por las propias características del producto. Es decir, la uva es particular, el tipo de mezcla es particular, el método de prensado, el método de filtrado, todo hace que el producto sea diferente y tenga unas características muy propias. Entonces, para ellos, esa diferenciación identitaria es básica como empresa, pero sí tienen claro que como producto general sí tienen que poder generar una entidad más grande, que es como las denominaciones de origen, de alguna manera, y que sobre todo funciona como una garantía de calidad, creo. No sé si con eso queda más claro.
Muy bien, Sara, muchas gracias por los comentarios. Tenemos, bueno...
I was going to ask Sarah some questions, but we can do that later.
¿Qué tal si recabamos una segunda ronda de preguntas y at the end you can... Por favor, Lorena.
Okay, very interesting presentations, both. I know the region quite well because my partner, he works at Cal Poly, he's a professor there. And I go there often. And for some reason, I didn't know why, when we visit wineries, we usually like to go to the west side versus the east side. And when I'm looking at your presentation, I'm also thinking of the meaning of wine and how people in Paso and San Luis, they're so identified with their wine region. I mean, they claim that they can make some of the best wines in the world. And when you visit other wine regions in any country that you have visited, I visit a few, and everywhere people claim we can make some of the best wine in the world. So my partner, he's French, and of course he says, "You're making vinegar." So of course he doesn't make many friends saying things like this. And so when you're talking about the east versus the west side, I'm thinking of places like Tobin James, which for people that don't know, I mean, it's more like a cowboy joint where they sell not so cheap wine, but it's on the east side. So it seems that although the wine is not that cheap, the whole marketing, the whole idea around it sort of like focuses on lower class. Versus when you visit some of the west side wineries like Donati, Viña Robles, other couple that are very, very nice, very stylish. And I'm thinking, well, this is part of the two identities that I think you're talking about. And so I think this idea of a wine, of something that is tailored for social class, for pretentious people. I mean, when you go to Valle de Guadalupe and you see some wineries, like I won't say the name, but one that's right next to Cheto, that is really tailored for lower class or sort of like uncultured people, versus some other wineries, and you're thinking, well, also here in Baja, people think, oh, we can make the best wine in the world. You're thinking, yeah, sure, okay. But I would like to know if somebody has explored this phenomena, because even in San Luis, when you talk to university professor, they'll say, we can make some of the best wines in the world. So one of my questions would be, first your opinion on this phenomena, and then what is the real market share of the Paso Robles wines versus a place like Napa, that in my view has much better wines than Paso? And what is the market share both in the US and worldwide? Because, if people are so embedded in this.
Muchas gracias, Lorena. Tenemos gracias por tu intervención. Luego te pedimos un tour por esa región, por favor. Y tiene también Jorge Carrillo una intervención.
I have two questions, Martin. One is, you know how many people are involved in the El Paso cluster in terms of owners, growers, entrepreneurs, etc., just in order to understand. And the second one is if there is undocumented people working in that areas. Para Sara, también dos preguntas. Primero, me da gusto que la tercera generación tiene aplicabilidad en otras áreas. La pregunta es, digamos, en el largo plazo, ¿cuánto tiempo consideras que puede tomar para que se consolide el clúster del valle o de los valles? Y si, digamos, puede haber en el umbral alguna comparación con estos clústeres del norte de California, o sea, si podemos llegar. Y la otra pregunta es, creo tener la respuesta, pero quisiera oírla, es ¿por qué no se venden los vinos mexicanos en ninguna de las tiendas en el otro lado, sean boutiques o más consumer stores?
Gracias, Jorge. Y una última intervención, por favor.
Gracias por la presentación, muy interesante los dos. Bueno, una pregunta particularmente para la doctora Sara Martínez, y que en las líneas de acción que se menciona, principalmente la económica, me pregunto cuál sería la posible estrategia para impulsar ese sector, para hacerlo crecer, y paralelamente, para impulsarlo, paralelamente, cuál sería la posible estrategia para la articular la integración de los actores de ese sector que lo componen. Entonces, no sé, me gustaría escuchar su opinión.
Muchas gracias. Le doy primero la palabra a Sara, esta vez, para terminar con la intervención de Kenny.
Si tuviese estas preguntas me contrataría en la Secretaría de Desarrollo Económico, yo creo. Pero voy a intentar contestar con algunos elementos derivados de... Sí, claro. Voy a vestirme de rojo. Bueno, vamos a partir tiempo de consolidación. Yo regresaría con una pregunta, ¿qué es un clúster consolidado? ¿Por qué? Una de las grandes discusiones es cuándo decimos que existe un clúster y cuándo no existe el clúster. Y es un grupo y es... mi personal respuesta es que existe un clúster cuando vemos que un grupo, que cuando tú sumas lo que representa en términos económicos en el PIB, realmente no pintan, empiezas a verlos teniendo acceso a muchos más recursos que sectores más grandes, empiezan a derivar una serie de beneficios, de sinergias que tú no ves en otros grupos no articulados, pero aparentemente más fuertes. Entonces, dicho eso, yo diría que más que una consolidación lo que va a haber es una evolución del clúster. Y creo que lo que va a hacer ese clúster es dos cosas, un poco dividirse internamente, no hasta el punto de generar dos clústeres, pero empezar a segmentar mejor qué tipos de empresas y a qué mercados se están dirigiendo. Ahora tenemos una especie de amalgama donde pequeños y grandes todos le pegan a todos los segmentos de mercado, por ejemplo. Entonces uno de los problemas que están teniendo es, a lo mejor tienen uno o dos vinos muy buenos, pero no tienen la capacidad de abastecer suficientemente al mercado como para que los encontremos en el otro lado, incluso aquí en las tiendas de vino en muchos de los casos. Entonces están ahora en un momento, yo creo, incluso como individuos más que como sector, en la disyuntiva de ver hacia dónde va a ir cada una de las empresas, y eso tiene más que ver por ahora con la consolidación de las empresas mismas que con la del propio clúster. Y creo que una vez que esté hecho eso, si vamos a asistir a esa consolidación del clúster en términos de una mayor claridad en qué acciones son las que van a emprender como grupo en general, también segmentando lo que ellos están haciendo como clúster. Yo en términos de la capacidad de negociación, por ejemplo, diría que es de los clústeres más consolidados que tenemos en el Estado. O O sea, es increíble que tengan la capacidad de tener una comisión en el Congreso, por ejemplo, y la tienen. O sea, consiguieron que la Secretaría de Economía dedicase 50 millones de pesos específicamente a apoyo al sector en un programa especial. Solo hay para maíz y para vino. Entonces, sí son cosas que para ser un sector de ese tamaño, bueno, pues llaman la atención, porque tú ves otros sectores muy grandes que no tienen ese tipo de capacidad de incidir en decisiones incluso a nivel federal. Entonces, yo por ese lado diría que más bien vamos a hacer una evolución, pero no hablaría de un clúster no consolidado. Hay entradas y salidas, no son siempre los mismos, pero sería un error, creo, pensar que el clúster tiene nombres y apellidos y es como esto, lo puedo definir, lo puedo dibujar y va a ser eso siempre. Entonces ahí creo que la consolidación va mucho en términos de que esa estructura institucional y esa lógica de negociación hacia afuera sí ya la tienen muy armada y están haciéndose más operativos dentro. Tope de crecimiento, realmente tiene mucho que ver con la capacidad que hay en términos de cultivo aquí. Creo que en términos de la eficiencia de lo que producen ahora no tienen malos indicadores. El problema es, bueno, pues el uso de otros terrenos que empezaron a reconvertirse de uva a otros cultivos cuando hubo algunos problemas ahí cuando se retiró Domecq de los valles, en que empezó a haber algunos productores de uva que ya no tenían a quién venderle porque los pequeños no tenían la capacidad de producción de vino. Entonces se dedicaron a producir alfalfa, tomate y demás, pero ahora se está incluso trabajando en un ordenamiento territorial para recuperar esos terrenos porque son, digamos que cultivos más afines incluso a un desarrollo de largo plazo en la zona. Entonces están trabajando en eso y yo creo que ahí realmente, pues probablemente el tope de crecimiento por cuestiones físicas sería 3 veces lo que estamos produciendo ahora, más o menos. 3-4 veces, y dependiendo si se extiende un poquito más a Mexicali, donde están abriendo algunas otras áreas, pero no es un vino de las mismas características. Comercialización creo que tiene mucho que ver con su capacidad de producción, básicamente. Ahí no los encontramos en el otro lado porque pues son casas que están entre 2.500 y 5.000 cajas. Entonces realmente venden todo y no alcanzan ya a ubicarse en más lugares en muchos de los casos, ¿no? Que es uno de los problemas que tienen para reforzar esa imagen internacional del clúster incluso. Estrategias para el crecimiento del sector. Efectivamente, orden, de alguna manera, porque todavía son empresas exitosas, pero cuando ves hacia adentro te sorprende el desorden. Es a veces, incluso las casas más consolidadas no tienen una idea de sus costos de producción, cosas tan sencillas como eso. Entonces, bueno, pues de repente uno se sorprende pensando que son empresas ya hechas y parece que está a veces más consolidado el clúster que las propias empresas. Entonces ahí como que hay que empezar a trabajar hacia adentro un poquito. Y la articulación, probablemente ahora está en un momento de reorganización y es un poco más que ese clúster empiece a generar ciertos mecanismos formales, porque ahora bueno, todos son miembros a través de esa estructura de sistema producto BID, pero no está muy claro qué servicios dan, qué servicios no dan, cómo son los mecanismos de decisión, pero están empezando a generar planes estratégicos en los que están bajando fondos para generar diferentes intervenciones en infraestructura, en mejora productiva, en lo que es todo el área, los diferentes valles. Entonces, creo que empezaron por los planes que van a obligarlos a estructurarse de una manera más organizada en términos de recursos, de formas de participación, sobre todo, que es lo que está discutiendo mucho ahora, precisamente por la representatividad de grandes, pequeños, quiénes están, quiénes no están, y a partir de ahí probablemente, bueno, pues empecemos a ver que empieza a mejorar su articulación.
Muchas gracias, Sara. Y finalmente hay muchas preguntas para Martin Kenny.
So let me. I want to go. So for me, the question is, are your AVA regulations here very strong? If they're not very strong, it's going to be very hard to create identity. So the government can give out all sorts of money and welfare stuff, but without a strong AVA rulings, there's defection problems. Can you bring in, is there percentages? So in the United States, it's 85% of the grape must be from Napa Valley or Paso Robles or Temecula or wherever to be a Napa Valley wine. If you don't have that set of rules, that you are going to have defection is going to be a very serious problem. Cheating. Once you have defection and cheating, it's very hard to have identity develop. Do you have an industry association? The Paso Robles VGA, Vintners and Growers Association, and then the Wine Country Alliance are absolutely crucial for sharing information, for creating identity, for lobbying the government. So if you don't have this, if your government, and it's national or state or whatever, I don't know Mexico, I'm not a Mexican, not an expert. If you don't have that set up, you are going to find it very difficult to create identity. Now that doesn't mean it won't exist, because it already exists. We know it. But it isn't going to create that positive interaction, because Lara's problems of fighting and will overwhelm a lot of the positive aspects. So you have defection, you'll have all of those things. I mean, you can't even talk about a schism if anybody can say I'm Guadalupe River Valley. It's a schism. You can't have a schism because there's nothing to schism about, to have a schism about. So it seems to me that when you're looking at the Mexican situation, you can't get this positive feedback loop if you don't have state involvement. So that was sort of you didn't ask me the question, but I'll give you my answer. A professor, we always answer even if we're not asked. Okay, so the when is it a cluster is a great question. Oh God. And the cluster literature to this day can't answer that, because it's hard to put a quantitative. What is the measure? 20% interaction or 50% of the suppliers are in the area. It's very difficult. So it's just a great question, and there's been lots of attempts to answer it, and I don't think there's been any metric that's developed on this, and this. It needs 10% of this and 5% of that. So great question, no answer. Okay, just say we don't have an answer. The cluster literature doesn't have an answer. Okay, so the employment in Paso Robles, my guess is it's no more than 5 to 10,000, adding the hospitality, everything on top of it. It's not huge. In Napa, it's much larger. Napa, okay, so the value, which is sort of to your question, I don't exactly know the value. Napa, for example, produces 5% of the grape juice in California and produces 30% of the value of all grape juice produced. So my guess is it's much lower than that. It's probably 3 or 4%, and probably something like 10% of the value. It's clearly not as high as the Napa Sonoma on the value added. Market share in the U.S. is going to be quite low. I don't know what it is, but compared to Napa, it's going to be market share is going to be very, very small. But it's recognizable. That's for sure. On the east side, west side, I think you've put your finger on it, though some east side wines have gotten very high rankings. Mm-hmm. But overall, as I showed here, the west side has higher rankings.
Like J-Lore, right?
J-Lore is on the east side.
Yes.
Yeah, J-Lore would be one. Eberly would be another one. Yes. That do have high rankings. The east side is where this started, really, and it started because it was a grape producer for other places, exporting for other places. But you put your finger on the identity issue. It is because, as a generalization, the better wines, the boutique wineries, are on the west side. However, at the end of the day, they decided that one identity with sub-AVAs was the way to go. So that battle was fought. It's now over. But yes, the west side people think they're better. But as a generalization again, I mean, they would certainly not say that some of the highly ranked wines from the east side are of no quality. I don't think they would say that. Goes back to Laura's question. Yes, in clusters, people fight. I don't like him. Oh, we're better than that. I don't like her. She's this. She's ugly, and he's anti. But at the end of the day, the point is that they have an interest in preserving the identity, which is sort of the Sarah. This one doesn't like that one. It really doesn't matter because to destroy the identity would be to commit suicide, right? It would be suicide for you and me. So I think they're fighting people fight all the time, right? Mondavi doesn't like him and she doesn't like her. That happens. But if you have an AVA, if you have this strong thing that binds you together, and it sounds to me like that's not what exists in Mexico. And if the state wants to do something, rather than giving subsidies, which means I get some money from the state and you don't, which is guaranteed to divide, the state should actually be looking to do things that would unify.
Okay, just one thing, because they are getting the money through an organization that's called, if you want, productive system, and they have to be registered there. So it's something like an AVA, if you want to say so. So it exists. It's weaker than yours, but it's already there anyway.
Well, I would say if you wanted to improve the place, rather than pour government money in funny ways that then you get into politics, you actually can create things, legal entities, that will actually push for the identity in much more powerful ways. Let's see, undocumented workers, I don't know, but surely there are, but I don't know how many and what percentage. I mean, they exist in Napa, but less and less, because the wine business, to some degree, is not completely, but is to some degree a year-round business. I mean, there are peaks during harvest, and that's where I would be looking for undocumented workers. However, you need people who cut those grapes right. Remember, an acre in Napa Valley, or in the west, not on the west side of Paso, but an acre of land is over $100,000 in Napa Valley for 1 acre. And you're producing 1.5 tons of grape per acre. And you send a whole bunch of undocumented people, or even Jorge and I out there, and start cutting away, you're ruining the grapes that are very valuable very quickly. So you can't just bring in a set of people who are picking cotton one day and now they're going, or tomatoes, and now they're going to go pick grapes. You might be able to do that in Gallo, which is machine harvested anyway, but you're not going to do that in Napa. You need skilled people. And what's interesting, I know more about Napa because we are looking at the labor in Napa, is that the vineyard managers which is a relatively high position, not as high as are usually coming from pickers over time. Some of my students are from their Latino students, right? And their dads are now vineyard managers, which is a relatively high value, high paid position. Doesn't make you rich, but it's relatively high paid. So there are some upward mobility pathways. So I think there are undocumented laborers for sure there, but you can't, there's some jobs you just can't have low-skilled undocumented workers that are turning over. And so there's a relatively stable workforce, more in Napa. We didn't look at the labor force in Paso, but my guess is that it's similar because the grapes are of high enough value that you just can't send anybody out into the field and have them cut. But I don't know their document status. So let's see. I think that covers the questions.
Listo. Pues muchísimas gracias, Martin. De verdad estamos muy agradecidos por la visita del profesor Martin Kenney. Yo no me gusta ser indiscreto, pero les puedo comentar que pronto tendrá un año sabático en su universidad y estamos viendo la manera de convencerlo de que se pase algún tiempo por acá, tal vez con algunos vinos del Valle de Guadalupe, donde, como ustedes saben, se hacen los mejores vinos del mundo. Thank you very much, Martin. Y muchas gracias a la doctora Sara Martínez y a Diana Peláez por su enorme ayuda.